Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We are opening a new session with two speakers. The first one is Professor Arie Kacowicz, who is the Chaim Weizmann Chair of International Relations and Professor of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He received his PhD from Princeton University in 1992 and has been a visiting professor at Georgetown University, Universidad Salvador in Buenos Aires, Alfonso Diez in Madrid, and the University of Notre Dame. He is the author and co-editor of 9 books, including Globalization and the Distribution of Wealth, The Latin American Experience, Cambridge University Press, 2013, co-editor with David Morris of Routledge, Handbook of Latin American Security, Routledge 2016, and co-editor with Galia Press Barnatan and Ruth Fine of the relevance of regions in a globalized world, Routledge 2019. He is currently completing a book manuscript on unintended consequences of peace, peaceful borders, and illicit transnational flows. His areas of interest include globalization and global governance, peace studies, and international relations of Latin America. His lecture today has the title Human Trafficking and Smuggling in the Americas, 1991-2018.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Lior. Thank you, Renan and Stephen, for inviting me. Coming to the Republic of Tel Aviv, it's always refreshing from Jerusalem, and it's nice that I'm using the opportunity that we like in academics to display new work or work in progress. So what I'll try to do in the next 50 minutes or so, and I'm sharing the panel with Andrea, that I discovered that we come from the same university and we share. So in a sense, it is a panel, and it is a panel directly related to the subject of the conferences. We are going to talk about illegal migrants, refugees, asylum seekers in a different context, not necessarily a Jewish context or a Muslim context or a Japanese context. And it's part, what I'll try to do very briefly and show you parts. This is part of a large project that I just finished with 3 PhD students of mine. One, she's a doctor already, Karen Sasson, Ezekiel Akowski, and Daniel Weiner. They are co-authors in a book that it's actually a book manuscript under review that looks at peaceful borders, not just in the Americas, in different regions of the world, and illicit transnational flows. So yesterday when we hear Omri, right, that you were talking about the TBA, it's one of the cases, although in the particular case of TBA, we didn't trace much of human trafficking and smuggling. So let me walk you through the, and as you see, this is Word. So let's see. Okay. So, as I said, it's part of a research of peaceful borders. So I'll start by putting that in a larger context. So I will start by defining human trafficking and smuggling, which is part of a larger issue of transnational crime and transnational crime organizations. So in addition to human smuggling and human trafficking, this is pretty much related also to weapons trafficking and to drug trafficking. I'm going to look at the Western Hemisphere, especially Latin America. I might mention very briefly the US-Canadian case in a different context, and I will briefly also refer to case studies. Again, I don't have much time to, I might tell you about possible explanations for the general phenomena. So just to put that in the context, so we should start by defining transnational crime, right? Transnational crime and as an illegal activity that has effects across national borders, and you have a very long list of crimes there, right? Money laundering, terrorist activities, theft of art, theft of intellectual property, illicit arms and trafficking, aircraft hijacking. So as part of that, you will find the particular example of human smuggling and human trafficking. Okay, so that's what I'm going to focus in the next few minutes. Okay, and if we look empirically in the Americas, we know that it's a reality of transnational organized crime. We know that not just from the narcos, right, series, but it's drug and arms trafficking, human trafficking and smuggling, right? And in different areas, the Andean region, the Amazon, the TBA that Omri, you were talking about, right? Money laundering, cybercrime, fraud, extortion, that can be conducted extraterritorially. So what I'm going to talk about, it has to cross physically borders, okay? And we know that transnational organized crime, in general, today is considered one of the major security threats. You know, I made part of my career talking about the long South American peace, right? So there are no wars, right? There are no armed conflicts. The last civil war more or less ended in Colombia, but then you have new security threats, right? Drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and those might be related. So we have drug cartels, gangs, etc. Okay? So specifically, and this is part and parcel of this conference, we are talking about human trafficking and human smuggling, okay? Human trafficking, I think it's the worst crime, because we are talking about the recruitment, transfer, harboring, receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force. This is, by the way, definition from the Palermo Protocol of 2000, right? There is a UN organization which is called UNODOC, which is the United Nations organization that deals against crime and drugs. So we are talking about the case of human trafficking, which is much worse than human smuggling, right? Because we are talking about let me just give you the exact definition of human trafficking, right? Because human trafficking involves the exploitation. This is what Andrea will be talking in a few minutes, exploiting men, women, children for the purpose of forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation. That's human trafficking. And the other phenomena, which might overlap, but it's slightly different, it's human smuggling. Human smuggling has to do with illegal migration, right? So migrants that they want the services of a third party to help them to cross illegally the border, but it might assume some kind of voluntary basis, right, for the illegal entry. The problem is that those two might get confused, because what might start from human smuggling might escalate into human smuggling. It has to do, the causes of that, with the level of organized crime and other issues. The cases that I'm going to refer is essentially from South and Central America through Mexico into the United States, right? And we have victims of human trafficking in the US, Canada, Japan, South America, and the European Union, just to mention a few countries and areas. Venezuela and Belize, they have a very bad reputation in that context nowadays, okay? And it's usually, you have an economic logic from the poorer countries toward richer neighboring countries, Bolivians to Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, and Paraguay, Paraguayans, Peruvians to Argentina and Chile, Central Americans via Mexico to the United States, okay? So that's the general context. Now, as I mentioned, and again, I don't have much time to tell you, this is part of the book manuscript. Again, just to give you an idea, since we are looking here at the transnational cross-border, transnational illicit flows, right? So if you look on the right side, most of the countries in the Americas, you have freedom of movement, right? With a few exceptions, right? So you have freedom of movement across the land borders. That's one thing that you have to keep in mind. And when you look at transnational illicit activities across land borders in the Americas, so the exceptions might be US and Canada. There is no much human smuggling and trafficking. By the way, there is an interesting phenomenon. We are looking at the Americas. From the US into Canada, now you have a flow of illegal migration, which is facilitated by benign non-state actors in the US that help illegal residents in the US to move into Canada, right? And I remember this exchange we have, David, on that. But in most of the cases in the Americas, in Latin America, we have human smuggling and trafficking alongside arms trafficking and drug trafficking. As Arie, you were saying yesterday, there are not many cases of terrorism in the Americas, okay? So that's, and then, again, I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm not going to tell you. It's a bit more complicated than that. So if we turn to the specific case studies very, very quickly, so I mentioned already US-Canada, US-Mexico. As we know, this is the world's largest migration corridor with several million Latin American illegal migrants from Mexico. But actually, nowadays, they are not coming from Mexico. They are coming from Central America through Mexico into the United States, right? And this is what we learned in the last few years, right? We have many cases of unaccompanied minors, right? And we have, especially with the Trump administration, their policy, which has been a policy of separating kids from their parents. So people were aware of that case. Because actually, those Central American migration is coming from the Northern Triangle. And they are not coming from the country that, Tuli, you are the expert on. They are not coming from Costa Rica, right? They are coming from the Northern Triangle countries. So they are coming from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And they are running away from their economic situation, from the legacies of the Civil War, from the maras, right? And that's the very difficult case, right? Cases of the so-called transportistas and coyotes that they take advantage of that illegal migration in terms of human smuggling. They turn them into human trafficking, right? So that's a major case. And the other case that we are going to listen soon, that Andrea will tell us, since you are going to deal that in much more detail, Ecuador and Colombia, it's from the Colombian borders, right? Because in the case of Colombia, against the background of the long civil war, you have domestic human trafficking within Colombia, and you have transnational human trafficking. And the numbers are quite staggering in terms of the number of Colombians that have been victims to that. What is interesting, as a footnote, you might say that in the last 3 years, that it used to be the case from Colombia into Venezuela, now it's the other way around. Right? As a result of the catastrophic situation in Venezuela, so nowadays you have cases of Venezuelan women that they are being exploited, they move to Colombia, so it's the other way around. Okay, so that's the phenomena. Now, the explanations for those illicit transnational flows, and again, I don't have much time to tell you that, but what we discovered in this research is that paradoxically, this might be a result of having peaceful borders. As a matter of fact, all of the borders in the Americas are peaceful. What is interesting is that most of the borders are open, but even in the case of the 45 border, which is the US-Mexico, that's not an obstacle for illicit flows, whether that's drugs and human smuggling in one direction and weapons trafficking in the other direction from the US into Mexico. I think that a further element to take into account has to do with governance. I mean, if the bordering countries are strong, not in the military sense, in the sense of having governance, so then you might have less of that human trafficking and smuggling. The opposite, if the countries are weak, so then you might have more of that. And of course, we have to look at the economic conditions, right? There's an economic rationale. The disparity in the socioeconomic conditions bring about a proliferation of human trafficking and smuggling. There is nothing new there, and it's not just a phenomena I have 2 minutes, of the phenomena in the Americas, because we found a similar phenomenon in Southern Africa, South Africa being the magnet for human smuggling and trafficking from neighboring countries. And we found a similar phenomena in Southeast Asia, where Thailand, right, it's famous or infamous for, again, human trafficking and smuggling. So if you have sustainable and developed socioeconomic conditions, so that might disable the proliferation of human trafficking. So finally, in terms of some kind of recommendations that we made at the end of the book manuscript, that again does not deal only with human smuggling and trafficking, but in general with illicit transnational flows. So we argue, and again there is nothing particularly new here, that we should change our stereotypical perceptions and prejudice. And I remember we had this lecture about prejudice, racial prejudice, right, in Brazil regarding migration, borders, and drugs, right? Because there is a tendency to think about migration in negative terms, at least at the official levels, and migration is an economic bonus for the receiving country and not necessarily a security threat. So the argument that we argue here, and we follow here, I think Mario Vargas Llosa wrote about that, and many others, that you should open the borders. Once you open the borders, then you might decriminalize, right? You might, in a sense, take away the economic incentive for the illicit business of human trafficking and human smuggling. And the other that might sound a bit outdated or kind of alte Sachen, but I think it still has its relevance, it's the idea that you should facilitate economic development and progress across the borders. By the end of the day, one of the ways to combating this really malaise of human trafficking and smuggling would be by promoting economic development, right? So to reduce the flow of illegal migration, this is an issue which is relevant to the US, it's relevant to Europe, so a big part of the answer should be promoting economic development in the countries of origin. I think I stick to my time. This was just a flavor. Anybody who's interested, I can send you the entire book manuscript. Thank you very much.